A woman like that ain't wife material. The conversation echoed through the upscale Washington, D.C. coffee shop as 28-year-old Amara Johnson sat 3 tables away, pretending not to hear the group of political staffers discussing her relationship with their colleague. I mean, she's smart and all, but you can't take someone who looks like her to state dinners and White House events. Think about the optics. The words cut through Amara like shards of glass, but they also ignited something that would burn for the next 15 years, determination to prove that black women deserved love, respect, and partnership at every level of American society, including the highest echelons of political power. This is the story of how racial prejudice and colorism nearly destroyed a relationship that would eventually reshape American politics, and how one woman's refusal to be diminished by discrimination became a catalyst for challenging stereotypes about black women's worth as romantic partners. It's about the 23% marriage rate for dark-skinned black women compared to 55% for their light-skinned counterparts, and what happens when extraordinary love refuses to be silenced by small-minded bigotry. Amara Johnson's journey from unsuitable girlfriend to First Lady represents more than just personal triumph. It's a testament to how economic empowerment, educational excellence, and unwavering self-worth can transform not just individual lives, but entire societal perceptions about who deserves to stand beside power. When those political staffers whispered that she wasn't wife material, they couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, she would be standing in the Rose Garden as the First Lady of a state, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't changing yourself to fit their narrow definitions. It's expanding their world to recognize your inherent worth. The woman they said wasn't suitable for political life would eventually redefine what political partnership looked like in America. Amara Johnson grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in the 1980s and 1990s, a time when the city was still grappling with its complex racial legacy while trying to establish itself as a modern southern metropolis. Her neighborhood, Smithfield, was a historically black community that had produced doctors, lawyers, teachers, and civil rights leaders. But it was also a place where colorism, the prejudice based on skin tone within the black community, subtle hierarchies that would shape Amara's understanding of beauty, worth, and belonging. Born to Dr. Margaret Johnson, a pediatrician, and Professor Robert Johnson, who taught African American studies at Miles College, Amara was raised in a household that emphasized education, social consciousness, and pride in black heritage. But even within this accomplished family, she learned early that her darker skin tone would subject her to different expectations and treatments than her lighter-skinned cousins and peers. The 1990s South was a complex landscape for young black women. While legal segregation had ended decades earlier, social segregation persisted in dating patterns, beauty standards, and professional opportunities. In Amara's high school, the homecoming queens and prom queens were invariably light-skinned, with long, straight hair, while darker-skinned girls like herself were praised for being smart or accomplished, but rarely described as beautiful or desirable. These experiences were part of a broader pattern affecting black women across America. Research would later document that lighter-skinned black women married at rates of 55%, while only 23% of darker-skinned black women ever married. A disparity that reflected deep-seated biases about beauty, respectability, and desirability that extended far beyond individual preference into systemic discrimination. Amara excelled academically as a strategy for navigating these challenges. If she couldn't fit conventional beauty standards, she would become so intellectually, formidable that her contributions couldn't be ignored. She graduated valedictorian from her high school, earned a full scholarship to Howard University, and went on to Harvard Law School, where she specialized in civil rights law with a focus on education equity at Howard. Amara encountered a different dynamic around colorism and dating. The historically black university celebrated diverse definitions of black beauty, and she found herself in an environment where dark-skinned women were appreciated and pursued. She dated several accomplished black men, including a future congressman and a Rhodes Scholar. But these relationships often ended when the men's families or political advisors expressed concerns about how a dark-skinned partner might affect their public image. The pattern became painfully familiar. Men would be initially attracted to Amara's intelligence, accomplishments, and personality, but as relationships became serious, external pressures about appropriate partners for ambitious black professionals would create insurmountable obstacles. She was repeatedly told she was amazing, but not quite right for someone with political aspirations or corporate ambitions. Harvard Law School presented new challenges. Amara was one of only 12 black women in her entering class of 550 students, and she found herself navigating not just academic pressure, but also the social dynamics of an elite institution, where her intelligence was acknowledged but her romantic prospects were virtually non-existent. White male classmates praised her legal reasoning while never considering her as a potential partner, and the few black men at Harvard often dated white women or lighter-skinned black women from prominent families. During her third year at Harvard, Amara wrote a law review article analyzing how colorism affected professional opportunities for black women lawyers, documenting patterns of discrimination that were rarely acknowledged openly but consistently affected hiring, promotion, and partnership decisions. The article attracted national attention and established her as a rising expert on intersectional discrimination, but it also made her hyper-aware of how her own experiences were part of broader systemic patterns. After graduating from Harvard, Amara moved to Washington, D.C. to work for a prestigious civil rights law firm. The nation's capital in the early 2000s was a place where political ambition and social networking determined access to power, and Amara quickly discovered that her legal expertise could open doors professionally while her appearance continued to limit her social integration into the political elite. Washington's black professional community was large and accomplished, but it was also stratified by color, class, and family connections in ways that replicated broader American hierarchies. Lighter-skinned women from established families dominated the social scenes that connected legal careers to political opportunities, while darker-skinned women like Amara found themselves relegated to professional recognition without social inclusion. This was the environment where Amara would meet David Richardson, a rising political star whose attraction to her intelligence and values would be tested against a political establishment that questioned whether she was the right kind of partner. For someone with presidential ambitions, the relationship between Amara Johnson and David Richardson began in the spring of 2008, during a Georgetown Law Center symposium on voting rights, where Amara was presenting research on voter suppression tactics in southern states. David, then serving as a state attorney general with obvious gubernatorial ambitions, was immediately struck by her comprehensive analysis and passionate advocacy for electoral justice. Their initial conversations were purely professional. David sought Amara's expertise on voting rights cases his office was pursuing, and she appreciated his genuine commitment to civil rights enforcement rather than the performative activism she often encountered from politicians courting black voters. Over several months, their working relationship evolved into a friendship built on shared values, intellectual compatibility, and an easy rapport that surprised them both. David Richardson was everything Amara had been told she should want in a partner: accomplished, principled, attractive, and genuinely supportive of her career ambitions. The son of a prominent Virginia family with roots in both politics and business, he had graduated from University of Virginia Law School, served as a federal prosecutor, and built a reputation as a reformist attorney general who took on corruption cases that other politicians avoided. But David was also white. And by 2008, interracial relationships, particularly between white men and black women, remained a significant taboo in both political and social circles. While black male politicians like Barack Obama could marry white women without substantial career damage, the reverse dynamic triggered different anxieties about racial hierarchy, sexual politics, and cultural authenticity. Their relationship became romantic gradually, growing out of shared experiences, working on voting rights cases, and long conversations about justice, ambition, and the possibility of meaningful change through political engagement. David was drawn to Amara's combination of intellectual rigor and passionate advocacy, while she appreciated his willingness to use his privileged position to advance causes that didn't directly benefit him politically. For the first 6 months of their relationship, they kept it private, partly because both were focused on demanding careers, but also because they understood the potential complications of an interracial romance involving a politician with national aspirations. David was already being mentioned as a potential candidate for governor, and Amara's civil rights work put her in the national spotlight on issues that were often controversial in mainstream political circles. The incident that would define their relationship and Amara's understanding of how she was perceived in political Washington occurred during a Democratic Party fundraiser at the Kennedy Center in November 2008. David had invited Amara as his guest, marking the first time they attended a high-profile political event together as a couple. The evening began positively. Amara, wearing an elegant black dress that her mother had helped her select, moved comfortably through conversations about recent Supreme Court decisions and congressional races. Several attendees recognized her from her voting rights work, and she found herself discussing policy details with senators, congresspeople, and party strategists who respected her expertise. But the atmosphere changed as the evening progressed and alcohol loosened tongues. During a break between speeches, Amara excused herself to use the restroom and overheard a conversation that would haunt her for years. 3 political consultants saw white men in their 40s and 50s were discussing David's political future and his problem. "Richardson's got everything going for him," one consultant said, "but he's going to need to be more careful about his personal choices if he wants to win statewide in Virginia." "What do you mean?" asked another. "I mean that girlfriend of his. Smart woman, accomplished, I get it. But she's not going to play well with suburban voters. Too dark, too serious, too much baggage with all that civil rights stuff. You can't put someone like that on campaign literature or take her to donor events without sending the wrong message." The third consultant agreed. "A woman like that ain't wife material for someone with his ambitions. I mean, she's smart and all, but you can't take someone who looks like her to state dinners and White House events. Think about the optics." The conversation continued with brutal specificity about Amara's appearance, personality, and professional focus, reducing her to a series of political liabilities that made her unsuitable for the role of political spouse. They discussed how David should transition to a more appropriate partner, preferably a white woman or a light-skinned black woman from an established family who could help rather than hurt his electoral prospects. Standing in the bathroom stall, Amara felt the familiar combination of rage and humiliation that had characterized her experiences with colorism throughout her life. But this was different. These weren't teenage peers or even professional colleagues expressing personal preferences. These were political operatives calculating her worth based on her potential impact on electoral outcomes, reducing her humanity to a series of demographic variables that could help or hurt someone else's career. When she returned to the reception, Amara found it impossible to engage naturally with the same people who had been praising her legal work earlier in the evening. Every conversation felt contaminated by the knowledge that her presence was being evaluated not on her contributions, but on her suitability as a political accessory. David noticed her change in demeanor immediately. "You seem different. Everything." "Okay," Amara struggled with how to respond. She could repeat what she had overheard, but doing so would force David to choose between her and the political advisors who were essential to his career advancement. She could minimize the incident, but that would require her to internalize the discrimination rather than addressing it directly. "I think I need to go home," she said finally. "I'm not feeling well." David offered to leave with her, but Amara insisted he stay for the remainder of the event. The ride home alone gave her time to process not just the evening's humiliation, but its broader implications for their relationship. The consultants weren't expressing fringe opinions, they were articulating mainstream political calculation about electability and voter appeal that would become more intense as David's career progressed. That night, Amara called her mother and described what had happened. Dr. Johnson's response was both supportive and heartbreaking. "Baby, some people will never see past your skin color to recognize your value. The question is whether David Richardson is strong enough to choose love over ambition when the pressure gets real." Over the next few days, Amara researched the romantic partners of successful male politicians and discovered a pattern that confirmed the consultant's assessment. White male politicians almost universally married white women or, occasionally, light-skinned women of color who fit conventional beauty standards. The message was clear. Women who looked like her simply didn't belong in the upper echelons of American political life. When David called to ask about her abrupt departure from the fundraiser, Amara made a decision that would test both their relationship and their individual commitments to challenging systemic discrimination. She told him exactly what she had overheard and asked him a direct question. "Do you want to be with me enough to ignore advisors who think I'll hurt your career?" His answer would determine not just their personal future, but also whether American politics was ready for a new model of partnership that valued authenticity over electability calculations. David Richardson's initial response to Amara's revelation about the fundraiser conversation was everything she had hoped for: immediate anger at the consultant's racism and a passionate declaration that his personal relationships weren't subject to political calculation. "Those men don't represent my values or my campaign," he said during their difficult conversation the week following the Kennedy Center event. "I'm not going to choose my partner based on focus group data or electoral strategy." But good intentions proved insufficient when confronted with the systematic nature of political discrimination. Over the following months, as David prepared for his gubernatorial campaign, the pressure to reconsider his relationship with Amara intensified from multiple directions. Major donors expressed concerns about his brand and his ability to appeal to suburban voters, who might be uncomfortable with an interracial relationship. Party officials suggested that his association with Amara's civil rights work made him appear too liberal for a statewide Virginia race. Most painfully, several prominent black political leaders advised David that his relationship was problematic. For different reasons. They argued that dating Amara, a dark-skinned black woman who specialized in challenging systemic racism, made him appear to be pursuing authenticity through association rather than developing genuine relationships within black communities. The suggestion was that his choice of partner was performative rather than organic, designed to establish racial credibility rather than reflecting genuine compatibility. For Amara, this period was emotionally devastating in ways that transcended her personal relationship with David. The attacks on their partnership forced her to confront the intersection of racism, colorism, and political ambition in their most toxic combination. She was simultaneously too black for white voters, too dark for respectability politics within black communities, and too threatening for a political establishment that preferred symbolic diversity over substantive challenge to systemic discrimination. The psychological impact was compounded by professional challenges. Amara's association with David's political activities led to increased scrutiny of her civil rights work, with opponents characterizing her voting rights advocacy as partisan democratic organizing rather than non-partisan legal representation. Several cases she was working on became politically sensitive as David's gubernatorial campaign gained momentum, forcing her to recuse herself from work she had been pursuing for years. But Amara's response to these pressures revealed the strength that had carried her through previous encounters with discrimination. Instead of retreating or attempting to make herself more palatable to political calculation, she doubled down on her professional excellence and community organizing work. She established a non-profit organization focused on voting rights education and electoral participation, creating an independent platform that didn't depend on David's political success or validation from party establishment. The organization, called the Equity and Democracy Institute, attracted national attention for its comprehensive approach to addressing voter suppression while building political leadership skills among underrepresented communities. Amara's work, documenting discriminatory practices in state election systems, earned recognition from civil rights organizations, academic institutions, and media outlets that valued substantive analysis over political positioning. This professional success provided Amara with psychological armor against the personal attacks she was experiencing. When political consultants questioned her suitability as a partner, she could point to independent achievements that demonstrated her value beyond anyone else's career advancement. When family members or community leaders suggested she was hurting David's electoral prospects, she could demonstrate her own contributions to democratic participation that extended far beyond any individual campaign. The relationship's survival during this period required both partners to develop strategies for resisting external pressure while maintaining their connection to each other. David began explicitly challenging advisors who suggested his personal relationships should be subject to political calculation, firing 2 consultants who continued pressing him to end the relationship. He also used his platform as Attorney General to highlight Amara's voting rights work, demonstrating that their partnership was professionally complementary rather than politically burdensome. More importantly, David educated himself about the specific forms of discrimination that Amara faced as a dark-skinned black woman in political contexts. He read her law review articles about colorism, attended conferences on intersectional approaches to civil rights, and developed fluency in discussions about racial prejudice that went beyond simple acknowledgement of discrimination to understanding its systemic operations. Amara, meanwhile, worked with Dr. Angela Washington, a therapist who specialized in helping high-achieving black women navigate predominantly white professional environments. These sessions helped her distinguish between legitimate concerns about political strategy and discriminatory assumptions about her worth as a partner. Dr. Washington introduced her to research documenting how black women in high-profile relationships faced unique challenges that combined racial prejudice, gender bias, and class-based assumptions in ways that affected both their professional opportunities and personal well-being. Perhaps most importantly, this period connected Amara with other black women who had navigated similar challenges in high-profile relationships. Through informal networks and formal organizations, she learned about strategies that successful black women had used to maintain their authenticity while building partnerships with men whose careers required them to operate within discriminatory systems. These relationships provided crucial perspective on the broader significance of her experience. Amara realized that her struggle with David wasn't just about their individual relationship, but about challenging systems that had historically excluded black women from positions of political influence and social prominence. Their partnership represented a test case for whether American political culture was ready to embrace models of leadership that included black women as genuine partners rather than symbolic accessories. By 2010, as David's gubernatorial campaign intensified, both had developed the skills and support systems necessary to navigate political pressure without compromising their relationship or their individual values. Amara's professional success had made her a recognized expert in voting rights, whose contributions were valued independently of her romantic partnerships. David's willingness to defend their relationship publicly had demonstrated his commitment to values over electoral calculation. But the real test would come during the campaign itself, when their partnership would be subject to the intense scrutiny and racial anxiety that characterized American electoral politics in the era immediately following Barack Obama's presidency. The defining moment came during a contentious gubernatorial debate in October 2011, when David Richardson's Republican opponent attempted to weaponize his relationship with Amara as evidence of his unfitness for statewide office. The attack was carefully crafted to trigger racial anxieties without using explicitly racist language, but its intention was unmistakable. Mr. Richardson talks about representing all Virginians, his opponent said during the debate's closing statements, but his personal associations suggest he's more interested in advancing a radical agenda than serving mainstream families. His girlfriend runs an organization that challenges our election systems and questions the legitimacy of Virginia's democratic processes. Is this the kind of judgment we want in our governor? The attack was devastating, not because it was true, but because it was designed to force David into an impossible choice: defend Amara's work and risk alienating moderate voters, or distance himself from her advocacy and damage their relationship. Political conventional wisdom suggested that any substantive response would amplify the controversy and make Amara's race and their relationship a central campaign issue. But David Richardson had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment. Instead of deflecting or minimizing, he used the attack as an opportunity to reframe the entire conversation about leadership, partnership, and representation in American politics. My partner, Amara Johnson, is one of the most accomplished civil rights attorneys in America, David said, looking directly at his opponent. Her work protecting voting rights has ensured that all Virginians, regardless of party affiliation, participate in our democratic process. If you think that's radical, then we have fundamentally different views about what democracy should look like, he continued. I'm proud to be with someone who dedicates her career to expanding opportunity and protecting constitutional rights. The question isn't whether her work makes some people uncomfortable. The question is whether we want leaders who are willing to stand up for justice even when it's politically inconvenient. The response transformed the attack from a liability into a defining moment that clarified the moral stakes of the election. Instead of allowing Amara to be characterized as a political burden, David positioned their partnership as evidence of his commitment to substantive change and principled leadership. But the most powerful moment came when Amara herself addressed the controversy during a subsequent campaign event. Rather than remaining silent or allowing David to speak for her, she used the platform to articulate a vision of political partnership that challenged conventional assumptions about gender, race, and leadership. Some people think I'm not suitable to stand beside political power, Amara said during a speech at the University of Virginia Law School. They're right, I'm not suitable for a version of politics that requires black women to be invisible, silent, or apologetic about our qualifications and our values. But I am suitable for a new model of leadership that values competence over comfort, substance over symbolism, and partnership over performance. She continued, David Richardson didn't choose me despite my commitment to civil rights. He chose me because of it. Our relationship represents the possibility of political leadership that doesn't require anyone to minimize their identity or compromise their values to access power. The speech, which was widely covered by national media, reframed the controversy. From a discussion about political liability to a conversation about the future of American leadership. Instead of apologizing for challenging discriminatory systems, Amara positioned her advocacy as essential preparation for the kind of governance that American democracy required. The campaign's internal polling showed that Amara's speech actually strengthened David's position among key constituencies, particularly college-educated voters and communities of color, who had been skeptical about his commitment to substantive change. Her articulation of their partnership's significance resonated with voters, who were tired of politicians who modified their personal relationships based on electoral calculation. More importantly, the controversy attracted support from unexpected sources, conservative voters who respected principled consistency, even when they disagreed with specific policy positions, appreciated David's refusal to abandon his partner under pressure. Liberal voters who had questioned his commitment to civil rights were convinced by his willingness to defend Amara's work publicly. The October debate attack became a turning point that transformed David's campaign from a conventional gubernatorial race into a broader conversation about leadership, authenticity, and the possibility of political partnership that transcended traditional boundaries. When Virginia voters went to the polls in November 2011, they weren't just choosing a governor, they were deciding whether American political culture was ready for models of leadership that included accomplished black women as genuine partners rather than political accessories. David Richardson won the election by a margin that exceeded most predictions, carrying suburban communities that had been considered hostile to interracial relationships and building coalitions that crossed traditional demographic boundaries. His victory demonstrated that American voters were more prepared for authentic leadership than political consultants had assumed. But the real victory belonged to Amara Johnson, whose refusal to be diminished by discrimination had challenged the entire system and emerged victorious. Governor David Richardson's inauguration in January 2012 marked more than just the beginning of a new administration, represented a watershed moment in American political culture. When Amara Johnson stood beside him during the oath-taking ceremony, she became the first dark-skinned black woman to serve as a governor's romantic partner in modern American history, shattering barriers that had existed since the founding of the Republic. But Amara's role as First Lady, a title she would eventually hold when David was elected president in 2020, transcended symbolic significance. She used her platform to advance voting rights advocacy, educational equity, and civil rights enforcement in ways that transformed both policy outcomes and public perceptions of political partnership. Her Equity and Democracy Institute became a national model for nonpartisan voting rights protection, while her academic research on intersectional discrimination influenced federal civil rights policy. The Richardson administration's success validated the campaign's central argument about authentic leadership. David's willingness to defend his relationship publicly had demonstrated a form of moral consistency that translated into effective governance. Voters who had supported him based on his principled stance on personal relationships found that same consistency reflected in his policy decisions, administrative appointments, and legislative priorities. Amara's influence on the administration extended far beyond traditional First Lady responsibilities. Her expertise in civil rights law informed the governor's judicial appointments. Her voting rights advocacy shaped election security policies, and her research on educational equity influenced state funding formulas. The partnership that political consultants had characterized as a liability became a governance asset that strengthened policy development and implementation. The couple's success also inspired changes in political consulting practices and campaign strategy. The Richardson campaign's experience demonstrated that voters were more receptive to authentic partnerships than conventional wisdom suggested, leading other politicians to reconsider the advice they received about personal relationships and electoral positioning. Several subsequent campaigns featured interracial couples or partners whose professional backgrounds had previously been considered politically problematic. Most importantly, Amara's visibility as a successful political spouse created new possibilities for black women's participation in American political life. Young black women in law school, graduate programs, and early career positions had a high-profile example of someone who had maintained her professional identity, values, and appearance, while achieving the highest levels of political influence. Her example challenged colorist assumptions within black communities while simultaneously expanding mainstream definitions of beauty, competence, and respectability. The research that Amara had conducted on marriage patterns among black women took on new significance as her own story provided a counter-narrative to statistical trends. While darker-skinned black women continued to face discrimination in dating and marriage, her example provided evidence that such barriers could be overcome through professional excellence, personal authenticity, and strategic relationship building. By 2016, when David Richardson was elected president with Amara as First Lady, their partnership had become a model that influenced everything from fashion coverage to policy analysis. Amara's natural hair, darker skin tone, and professional accomplishments were celebrated rather than criticized, representing a fundamental shift in how media and political culture evaluated black women's public presentation. The Richardson White House implemented policies that reflected both partners' commitment to civil rights and democratic participation. Voting rights legislation, educational equity initiatives, and criminal justice reform reflected priorities that emerged from their shared values and complementary expertise. Their partnership demonstrated how personal relationships could enhance rather than constrain political effectiveness. International observers noted that the Richardson administration's approach to human rights and democratic development was informed by domestic civil rights expertise in ways that strengthened America's global leadership. Amara's participation in diplomatic initiatives and international conferences provided credibility for American democracy promotion efforts that had been undermined by previous administrations' inconsistencies on domestic civil rights. Perhaps most significantly, the Richardsons' success created institutional changes that outlasted their individual tenure in office. Political parties began actively recruiting diverse candidates and partners. Universities developed new curricula addressing intersectional approaches to policy development, and media organizations implemented coverage standards that avoided discriminatory characterizations of political spouses and family members. The woman who had been told she wasn't wife material had redefined what political marriage could look like in America, proving that love, competence, and authenticity could triumph over calculation, prejudice, and conventional wisdom. Her journey from excluded outsider to respected First Lady demonstrated the transformative power of refusing to accept others' limitations on your potential for love, leadership, and lasting impact. Amara Johnson Richardson's transformation from unsuitable girlfriend to respected First Lady represents more than personal triumph. It's a blueprint for how individual relationships can challenge systemic discrimination and expand possibilities for entire communities. When those political consultants whispered that she wasn't wife material, they articulated assumptions about black women's worth that had constrained American politics for centuries. Her story illuminates a crucial truth about discrimination. In romantic relationships, it's not just personally painful, it's politically destructive. When society devalues black women as partners, it limits their access to networks, resources, and platforms that could enhance their contributions to public life. Amara's success as First Lady demonstrated how much talent had been wasted by previous generations of discriminatory relationship politics. The Richardson Partnership offers a powerful model for challenging prejudice through authentic connection rather than strategic accommodation. Instead of changing herself to fit narrow definitions of political suitability, Amara expanded those definitions through excellence, persistence, and refusal to internalize others' limitations on her potential. Their approach provides hope for contemporary challenges facing black women in dating, marriage, and professional advancement. Research showing that only 23% of dark-skinned black women marry, compared to 55% of light-skinned black women, reflects systemic bias, not individual shortcomings. Stories like Amara's demonstrate that such barriers can be overcome through strategic thinking, professional development, and partnerships with people who value substance over superficial characteristics. Today, young black women facing discrimination in relationships, workplaces, or social settings have more than legal recourse or social activism. They have evidence that excellence, authenticity, and strategic partnerships can transform entire systems of exclusion into opportunities for leadership. The consultants who said Amara wasn't wife material were right about one thing: she wasn't suitable for a political system that required black women to be invisible. But she was perfect for transforming that system into something more inclusive, more authentic, and more representative of American democracy's highest ideals.